Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is an award-winning author who studied creative writing at Bath Spa and Goldsmiths University. Her first novel, After the Fire, A Still Small Voice, won the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize and a Betty Trask Award and was shortlisted for the Orange Prize for New Writers, the Commonwealth Prize and many others. In 2013, she was included on Granta magazine's Once a Decade Best of Young British Novelists lists. Her second novel, All the Birds Singing, won countless awards, including the Miles Franklin, the Encore and the Jerwood Fiction Prize. As well as writing, she runs Review, the independent bookshop based in Peckham, South London. Her latest novel, The Echoes, looks at the themes of love and grief, including those who discover secrets and who has the right to reveal them. Evie Wyld, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Hello, thanks for having me.
I have to remind you that we first met at Cheltenham Festival and we were doing a panel about the Japanese author Haruki Murakami. And I think it was you, in fact, who was reading from the Wind-Up Bird Chronicles. It was that bit, wasn't it, where the skin has been peeled off. That really, really gruesome bit.
Yeah.
And then in the audience, somebody fainted. Yeah. And you and I just kind of looked at each other in terror and you carried on reading and I pretended that I couldn't see what was going on as the St John's ambulance came in and very quietly took her out the auditorium.
I know. Thinking back, not the best section to read to an audience.
Oh, my goodness.
But I was asked about 6 months before, what part of Murakami reading changed the way you write, and I immediately thought of that scene because it genuinely did, and then thought nothing else about it. And then everyone else, I think it was David Peace and David Mitchell, it was all like about cats and spaghetti.
Yeah. Why did it change the way you write?
I think because it's so hard to do horror in the written word, and it was so visceral without being over the top. I mean, it is incredibly gory because it's a man being flayed, but it made me realise how, the way to do it is to really go in sparsely with your language and just describe it, just say what's happening and not put any kind of weighty, kind of poetic language around it. It's just what it is.
Well, it works for Murakami, but it also works for you. I mean, you've been incredibly successful. You were born in Peckham in South London, but your mother was Australian, and her history seems to just, I suppose, resonate throughout your writing and indeed her ancestors' history. So I thought we'd go right back, even before your childhood, through generations of your family, notably your great-great-grandfather. Tell us about him.
So his name was Frederick Strange, and he was a botanist. And he went over there and sent back samples to the British Museum. And he was killed by Indigenous people on an island called Percy Island. And it's a story I've always grown up with. And it's had very different slants on it, depending who was telling it to me. And then when I started writing and thinking about my family, way back 20 years ago, I started just sort of, the question that was in my head was like, what did he do what was he doing out there? What did he do that made him get killed, basically? And I don't know. I've got no answers, but I'm just very aware of what was going on at that time in Australia.
Of course, because there's this huge history of white brutality towards Indigenous Australians, and that's something that is still very much felt in the country today.
Absolutely. There was a genocide really in Tasmania, and not far off the rest of Australia. And I think there's a real struggle. The thing that I was interested in kind of writing around in this book, in The Echoes, was the awkwardness of white Australians, the inarticulate way that we try and process what happened, and we try and, in inverted commas, be good now. And I think that's what interests me, because it stresses me out to talk about it, because it's uncomfortable, having this weighty bit of history, your ancestors did some horrendous things. And this is true of most white people, you know, the world over. Most Europeans have that in their ancestry. And I think it's just so recent. And in Australia, there is, I think, because it's so recent, a sort of a papering over a little bit. You know, we do this, like, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land before we have an arts event. And it's like, well, then shouldn't we leave? We're acknowledging that this is not our land. And it's really tricky. So I think also because my family who are out there now are farmers, and they, you know, things are a little bit not backwards, but, you know, they're not in a metropolitan city. Some of their views have always been uncomfortable to me, and, you know, I love them very much. And that's a funny thing, to love people whose ideas you don't agree with.
Your debut after the fire, A Still Small Voice, that was in 2009. But that also went back into history. An Australian-Vietnam War veteran with PTSD. That was modelled around your uncle.
It was, yeah. He was conscripted and he was a machine gunner. So he was the guy that, you know, needed to be picked off first. And it was another thing that was not talked about much in Australia because it was very contentious that Australia were in the war in the first place. They were brought in basically at a point where Americans were like, we need people who are good in jungles. And they assumed that any Australians would be excellent. And, you know, my uncle was a pie maker. So not so much a machine gunner at first. Yeah, it was something that when he came back, you know, he couldn't go into pubs in his uniform, that sort of thing. He'd get shouted at in the street if he was in uniform. And that's a sentiment I totally kind of understand. But for him, bringing back that trauma, having lost all of his friends, having killed boys.
And he showed you pictures of those boys.
He had a photo album which has, you know, helicopters and jungle, and then occasionally just a dead boy in black pyjamas. Yeah. And I saw those when I was about 11. I remember because I was watching Total Recall at the time, weirdly, and so the two are like really linked for me, just that the sort of cartoon violence and then being shown this album. And I think it was, you know, I love my uncle. He's a wonderful, kind man. You know, he cries about his dogs, he cares about animals. And then seeing that he'd done these things and then taken photographs, it really kind of, it's just something that's been with me since I saw them. And I was like, well, was it in memoriam, or is it a way of understanding, or is it trophy? And I think that question again is something that's always interested me, and I don't know if he knows.
And it is fascinating also in terms of responsibility and how we absorb this into our culture. So, for instance, Viet Thanh Nguyen talks about the game of cowboys and Indians being ubiquitous across the world. And yet what we're really doing when we play that game is celebrating a genocide, but we don't think about it like that. It's so deeply steeped within our culture.
Absolutely, yeah.
You go on to talk about in All the Birds Singing, which came out in 2014. For me, this is the most Murakami-like of your books, if you like. It's skin-tingling.
Thank you. Not skin flaying.
No, enough of the flaying now. That had, again, a great woman character. She flees Australia. What's she running from?
She is running from actually probably the same thing that Hannah in The Echoes is running from. They're running from themselves. They're trying to become someone else. And the easiest way to do that is by leaving the country and going as far away as possible. I always feel like that's something that I'm capable of. You know, I think the urge to just go, right, I'm going to start again, is strong.
Which your mother did, of course.
Yeah, so she left Australia and the pie shop when she was 21, and she was just going on holiday with her boyfriend. That was the plan. But she ended up meeting my father in England, who was very, very British and couldn't hack Australia at all. So she left with plans to come back in maybe a year and never, you know, we visited, but she never went back to live. And I think that sort of Cleve is a place that I write from, that I always thought about her homesickness when I was a kid, and I always aligned myself with her. I was like, I'm more Australian than British, and obviously if I do radio in Australia, they're like, that's absolutely not true. Very disappointing for them. But I think that is that yearning for another place, you know, and the light and the smell. I find like we both walk the dog together quite often, and there's a gum tree in the park, and we will take a handful of leaves and crush them up, and it does transport you. And I think that sort of thinking about those sensory things was really important to me as a child, and dreaming myself back there. I would daydream about being in Australia, and then I would night dream about being in Australia. And so then when I was there, I'd be really paranoid that I was asleep. So yeah, it's definitely somewhere that feels like a part of me, which is strange when, you know, we were only so recently out there. You know, my grandmother on my mother's side left South London to go and live in Australia because her father had been gassed in the war, and so it was to try and save his lungs. So really I'm not very Australian at all, you know.
But your grandmother on, I think, your father's side was one of the people that inspired your next book, The Base Rock. Tell us about that.
So my grandmother and my father died within, I think, 6 months of each other in 2011, and I inherited my grandmother's photo albums. And in those albums were all of these photographs of my father in like a dreadful woolen swimming costume as a child in front of the Bass Rock up near Edinburgh, North Berwick. And it's a place that I used to go a lot as a child because we had family around there. And I have the same pictures of myself in a less dreadful swimming costume as a small child in front of the rock. And it was this funny telescoping of time that it's like, you know, the rock is the same and all of these people have left and all of this stuff has happened to these people. And then there were also these photographs of my grandmother on her honeymoon with my grandfather, and she was very young and she was his second wife. His first wife had died incredibly young of tuberculosis, and he had 2 little boys from her. And there's very much a feeling that he married a young woman quickly to have a mother. And that was the sort of story that I was brought up with. My father didn't have a good relationship with her, and there was a lot of avoiding her. And she was this really tall, kind of steely woman who chain smoked and said things like, "Darling, isn't it ghastly?" And we kind of avoided her quite a lot. And I suddenly saw in these photographs like an alternate version of her where she was a little bit sexy and interesting and vivacious even. Whereas by the time I met her, she was tired and angry, and she had been an alcoholic for many years. So she dried out, I think, at 75.
Wow.
And lived till her 90s. So she was really pissed off with being alive. She thought that her husband, who had died about 20 years before her, had gone to heaven and met up with his ex-wife, who died when she was young and beautiful. And so her feeling was, I need to get up there and sort this out.
Well, the whole idea of kind of a life or things carrying on after death is really what's at the heart of your new book, The Echoes. It centres on Hannah, who's a young woman in England, estranged from her Australian family. We come back to the same sort of theme, but there are multiple voices in this book and lots of time switches. You see it from different perspectives. Tell us more.
I think because of the way that I wrote The Bass Rock, which was I had a small baby and I had an hour a day to write, so I would just write whatever was at the front of my head, really. I didn't have too much time to think about it. I'd kind of got into that mode of writing, and I sort of carried it on a bit with this to a lesser extent. Like there was less on the cutting room floor with this one, but I wanted to look at a character from as many viewpoints as possible. So it starts out with Max, who is a ghost and is the ghost of her boyfriend who is haunting her, and he's seeing the things of Hannah that he didn't see in her when he was alive. And so it starts out with this feeling that it's his story. And I was quite keen to kind of pull the rug from under him a bit, and for him to realise it's not his story, that we're all sort of background characters to other people's lives. And actually the main character is Hannah. And you see her before Max has died as in their relationship, and then you see her as a child, and then you also get voices from other people who knew her in Australia, either knew her well or just knew her to see her in the street.
Now, one of the things that he doesn't know is that she has an abortion, and she is very ambivalent about motherhood. And it's interesting that you were talking about sort of writing when you just had a baby. And I wonder if motherhood itself changed how you wrote about that whole experience.
Yeah, I think as soon as you become a mother, there's a whole trench of subjects you feel like you're not allowed to go near. And one of them is like feeling uncomfortable about being a mother. And, you know, I have a glorious child. He's excellent and I really enjoy hanging out with him. But I often think about, you know, who the ghost of the Evie that didn't have children or child, and what she's up to. And I think of her very much as a real entity. And I'm someone who finds it difficult not to be alone for the majority of the time. And obviously you have a child and then that doesn't happen anymore. And then I also am quite an anxious person. So you have a child and you're never safe again. And, you know, sometimes you kind of think, oh, it'd be nice not to have that constant thread of anxiety running through you, that your heart is just on two legs walking off around the corner.
It really is, isn't it? It's startling how that change happens. I remember driving, you know, fast racing cars before I had a baby, and then afterwards just not wanting to do anything like that.
Suddenly your own death matters. But before I had a child, I was like, well, it would be nice for my parents if I died after them. But, you know, everyone will be fine, I'm sure. And now suddenly it's like, I can't do anything dangerous, because if I die at the wrong spot, you know, it becomes this, you give birth and then it's a race to the grave, but you have to get there at just the right point.
Yeah. I mean, there's more children in this because you touch on the stolen generations. Tell us about that.
So the stolen generations happened up until the 70s in Australia, and that is where Aboriginal or Indigenous children, whether they were mixed or pure Indigenous, would be taken from their families and housed in, basically, they were called schools, but training facilities to train them to become more white and to serve white people, basically. So they were taught sort of basic maths, how to buy stuff at the market and stuff like that, how to clean. And their language was stripped away from them, their culture, their names were changed. So there was no way of being found again. There was no way of, you know, where they were from was not recorded, none of that. It was just another child to change. And that happened up until the 70s. So there is in the book a schoolhouse where this happened, and it's obviously empty now because it's in the present day. But the sort of the ghosts of, not the ghosts really of individual people, but the ghosts of that happening is there. I think, you know, talking again about that discomfort of being a white Australian, I was very careful that, you know, what's my story to tell in this? And it's not from that point of view. And it felt dangerous even kind of poking around in there, because I didn't want to co-opt something that wasn't mine. But what I wanted to do instead was show how, so there's a character called Uncle Tone, who is charismatic but arguably from hell. And I wanted to give an imperfect white character the opportunity to try and voice some of those concerns and worries, because I didn't want there to be like a good white person who feels deeply sad and regretful. I wanted it to come from someone who's more gritty and more complicated, and that it's part of, it's part of a larger trauma of a country that, we did this awful thing, and you can reach out and touch it. It's so close.
And it's an inheritable thing too, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's changed the course of so many people's lives. Yeah, sort of thinking about, I think about inheritance a lot in that book, which is, part of it started from a conversation I had with my mother, where I found out that my grandmother, who had gone over as a £10 pom, had been put into an orphanage with her sister for a period of time because they came over. Her father died quite quickly of lung problems, and then her mother didn't have any money, so the girls had to go into an orphanage. And I didn't know that until quite recently, and suddenly the way that my mother responds to me makes sense, and the way that I respond to my child makes sense. And the way that none of us can do goodbyes, and, none of us can really do emotion very well in person because you have to keep it all packaged away neatly. So, yeah.
I want to go back to what you were saying about ghosts, because Max is a ghost, and you've talked about the ghosts of these children, or at least the ghost of the place. Do you believe in ghosts?
I think it's a really interesting, difficult question to answer. I'm definitely afraid of them. I don't believe in any of the afterlife versions that have been proposed to me. But I do believe that people see ghosts. And I don't know what they are, but I have a feeling they have more to do with the living than the dead person. Me and my husband were scared, isn't quite the right word, but we left the house that the flat that book is set in Tulse Hill, because of a ghost. So,
oh no, tell us the story.
Well, we lived there for about 3 years, and then we had our son. And the 3 years leading up to that were okay. It was a strange house. It sort of looks a bit like the house in Psycho. And we were in the top bit. And I would, very sleep deprived, very anxious, completely insane that I had a baby, couldn't get to grips with that at all. And so no sleep at all, but then would wake up, which is also a very common thing when you have a young baby. You wake up with this like absolute, like the bed's on fire sort of feeling. There would also be smells, strange smells. Also happens a lot with a baby. But really, smelling things in your dreams and stuff like that. And the baby would scream. Again, that's what babies do. But he would scream and he would look into a certain corner of the room. Sometimes he'd wave into that corner of the room. I have a little video of him just standing up in his crib and waving. Then there were things like there was a swarm of bees in the loo, which is like from telly, And also there was a swarm of bees in the loo because there was a swarm of bees outside, which is a completely natural thing. And they just happened to come in under the sink in the bathroom. It's just all of these things added up, and it culminated in my husband was looking after our son and I'd gone out, and he went down at that point in babyhood. The only way to get him to sleep was by rocking him in the pushchair. And my husband had tried to kind of walk around with him and get him to sleep and not go all the way down to the ground floor and get the pushchair, but couldn't do it. So he made the baby safe on the bed, went down 3 flights of stairs, hearing the baby screaming and screaming all the time. So super stressful. Picked up the pushchair, and on his way up, he had about a floor of stairs to go. He heard someone go, shh, shh, shh. And the baby was quiet for about 3 seconds and then went ballistic. And he ran it, he'd been trying to get the baby to sleep for about an hour, and he ran in, turned all the lights on, looked under the bed, looked in all the closets. And then we were just like, let's go. We weren't quite scared out in the middle of the night, but we did quite quickly go, well, why don't we move in with my mum for a bit and sell this place?
Oh, my goodness. Wow, that's extraordinary.
And the amazing thing about the painting on the cover of the book. This is an existing painting of someone I didn't know before the book was published. And that is almost exactly the layout of our flat. Like, that looks like you're standing in the kitchen looking out. It's quite weird.
I hope you live in a nice place now.
Yes, we do. It's fine.
When you're talking about the other Evie, this person who's kind of changed and lost some part of who she was, although, of course, gaining some other wonderful bit, I wonder who that Evie was, or what you thought of her, or what you think of her now, the person that earned this spot on Granta's 2013 list of the 20 best British writers under 40, because it's a huge, huge accolade, and it's a huge, I think, burden to be put on any young writer. And I wonder, did it set up expectations? Did it make success harder for you, or was it somehow easier? Was it a life-changing moment?
It was, I think. I mean, I don't know what the other Evie who didn't get on that prize list would have done, but I met a lot of amazing people, so there was a lot of travel involved with it. And I travelled loads. I went to so many different countries and hung out with people in a way that you wouldn't normally if you were going there on holiday. You know, if you're out there to work, you make different connections with people. So that was really amazing. You know, if I'm doing an event or something, I tend to just totally disassociate, and I have no memory of what I said or who I was or the questions that were asked. And I think that's the only way I can really do it. I think, had I known when I was writing my first book that there would be, you know, radio involved or public speaking or any of that sort of stuff, I probably wouldn't have written it because I was incredibly shy. And so, you know, I've learned how to do it, but a huge part of me is just like, I'm just grubbing about, I don't know what I'm doing, you know.
You don't just write, you teach as well, and you have a bookshop.
I do. I help run a little bookshop in Peckham called Review, which is lovely. And when I say I help run it, I go in if everyone else is sick and just sort of screw up the till a bit.
And in terms of teaching?
I work for a company called The Novelry, and I do writing coaching on that. So I was teaching at Goldsmiths, and before that I was at Kent. But the nice thing about The Novelry is it's, you know, it's from home, and it's a really great course. What's
next for you?
Oh, God, I suppose I could write another one. I'm sort of dipping my toe into trying to write for TV, but I'm just having a bit of fun at the minute, just trying out different ideas. I've started another novel, but I've kind of hit a wall with it. I've hit the 5,000 word wall where you wonder if you want to go in another direction.
Well, I absolutely urge listeners, particularly after they've heard everything you said about your incredible own ghost story and all of this stuff about your ancestors, to read this book and read it through the lens of knowing that about you. I think it really enriches the experience. It's a wonderful book. Evie Wyld, thank you so much for coming on to talk to me.
Thanks for having me.
The Echoes is published by Jonathan Cape. It's by Evie Wyld. It's out now. And you've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu and Sana Jamani. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.